They're supposed to be able to pull these international levers, and then the whole world would we'd all get along better because we're so interdependent, and it would be too risky to go to war with each other. That was the idea. And of course, it's a bunch of horsemen. Or like I just saw a story about China makes the manufactures the drones that it sells to the United States, manufactures the drones that it sells to Russia, and the United States provides drones to Ukraine. So China's profiting on both sides of this war, and it seems to me like the same old. And anytime there was a war in history. But anyway, my point is just all this international, this global reset nonsense, and this international interdependence. It's all nonsense. It just doesn't work. It's horsemanship. But
we didn't. I made a mistake, and we haven't been online as long as we should have. So Paul selected the topic tonight. He was sitting silently, looking very unhappy and bored last night. So I told him he could select the topic tonight, and he selected the Great Reset. Sam says it's not really his thing, but that's what he's talking about here. And Paul, why don't you go ahead and introduce it? Oh, but before we do, we have to recite the disclaimer. We are going to be talking about the Great Reset. However, nothing we say here may be construed as a challenge to the medical establishment's wisdom regarding COVID. So one, two, three, paraphrase with me the immortal words of the Cowardly Lion in The Wizard of Oz. We do believe in COVID.
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 We do believe in COVID, and in vaccinations and boosters and bears. Oh my!
We do believe in vaccinations and
COVID and
bears. Oh my!
I can't believe I screwed this up. We do believe in COVID. We do believe in COVID. We do believe in COVID, and in vaccinations and boosters and bears. Oh my! All right.
We do believe in COVID. We do believe in COVID. We do believe in COVID, and in the efficacy and necessity of vaccinations and boosters and bears. Oh my!
Okay, Paul, this is your topic. You've got the floor.
I know our major focus is on the racial survival of our people, but I don't really think that the Great Reset is entirely divorced from that, because the same people who are the enemies of our people, who want us basically to fade away, and if we don't fade fast enough, to be genocided away or overwhelmed, are the same ones pushing the what's called the Great Reset. I saw an interesting comment just yesterday. A fellow by the name of Fink, who is the head of Blackwell, I think, a major investment or management company that has several trillions of dollars under its control, said that what's happened recently is probably the end of globalism. I take it he wasn't very happy with that, but if that's true, I guess that's good news. I think most people by now have heard about the Great Reset, and we first started to hear about it, except perhaps in rarefied circles in graduate schools, soon after COVID hit in March of 2020. And Klaus Schwab, who is the chief force behind the World Economic Forum, which meets every year in January or February in Davos and brings together important politicians, movers, shakers, industrialists, bankers, rock stars, and so on. He wrote the book, and he looks forward to using the disruption caused by COVID and the forced lockdowns and all the other destruction of our rights and so on, as an opportunity to reset the whole order. And he's written about it, but so has a man who is also very important. He's a Canadian and another arch conspirator, Mark Carney. He was the former head of the Bank of Canada and then became head of the Bank of England. He's now the UN. He's got a great long title, the UN Special Envoy on Climate Change, and he was one of the major movers and shakers at the recent climate conference in Glasgow. And he's written a book about it, and he's quite blunt. He says climate change is an existential threat. It is the greatest threat in human history. And at this point, I think your eyes begin to glaze over. I mean, this is just bullshit of the first order. But anyway, climate change is an existential threat. We have to deal with it, and the only way we can deal with it is to get off carbons. In order to do that, there's going to have to be much less travel, much less air travel, much less car travel. But I imagine, except for him and the other globalist elite, there will be less food, less variety. It will be a leaner, meaner future, and there will be less tolerance and fewer rights. I mean, it's quite blunt about it. This is not an interpretation of what he said. It's what he said, this idea has seriously turned on an awful lot of people when the restrictions first came in, and the ultra environmentalists noticed there was a lot less car travel. Well, there's fewer places to go to if you're working from home or locked down. They thought, well, this was great. We can now bring in more measures to lock in the attack on fossil fuels, more gasoline taxes, or in Canada they call it a carbon tax. They were absolutely excited by that. I think the crisis in the Ukraine there's been a major spanner slung into the works here, because it turns out Europe will freeze in the dark if they don't have Russian gas. And so, okay, what do we do? What do we do? Well, wind power hasn't worked too well for the Germans. Solar power doesn't work too well. They won't go back to nuclear, but it's caused a bit of a rethink. Maybe we shouldn't be getting rid of gas and oil. So but it's that totalitarian, utopian dream, which would be a complete butchering of our rights. And there is that slogan that by 2030 you will own nothing and be happy. It's possible. I can see how we might be reduced to owning nothing. Being happy, I doubt that. Anyway, those are my concerns. But then those are the same people who are dead set in favor of diversity, which of course means fewer whites. I read a lot of corporate annual reports, and it's amazing. I could write that section. Almost every president or CEO in their introduction says, our company is diverse, is strongly committed to fighting climate change, and we've got a plan, to diversity, welcoming more diversity and inclusion and tolerance. Some companies even have mandatory seminars, and I'm thinking of a company called Pembina in the Canadian oil patch. You'd think they'd be among the most conservative. Well, no, they've got an active program for preaching diversity and tolerance to their employees. But these two interests really overlap. The same people who basically want to get rid of us also want to make those who survive much poorer. I think that's part of the challenge we face.
Yeah. And why do you what do you have an interpretation of why corporate authorities are so gung ho for this?
I don't know. One thought that occurs to me is it's mostly bullshit. These are the currently right things to say about diversity and all that, so they pay lip service to it. That would be bad enough, but I'd be somewhat consoled if they were just saying that and are being cynical. But I've seen enough of certain companies to know that they actually believe this. I heard a diversity woman who was going over her traumas coming out as bisexual, but that led her into, I think she's a professional diversity consultant. I heard her on the radio today, but she said it's not only the right thing, it's the profitable thing. A company that gets diversity and inclusion right will be a stronger company, will make more money. So one explanation is they're being cynical and saying what they think they need to say. I'm not completely tied to that. Another is they believe this shit because they would have gone to university. The people making decisions now are in their 50s, 60s. So they would have gone maybe 10 years after Sam and I. And they're learning this stuff there. So that while they might think of themselves as entrepreneurs or business people, they have imbibed enough white self-hatred and basically the cultural Marxist view of the world, except that they're making money. So there isn't the consistency. Well, geez, if I really believe I'm a part of an oppressor class, I shouldn't continue to oppress people. I should, I don't know, be a social worker or something like that. But so I don't think it's entirely incomprehensible that there's a divide between the job they do and what they believe. I mean, I assume many of them actually believe this nonsense.
Don't you think they have to function in the real world? And any corporation that got out of line would face real risks at the hands of regulators and others. And my mind goes back to the Arab oil embargo after we supported Israel in her war in the early 1970s. And Mobil Oil included in its annual stockholders report a statement to the stockholders that they had large investments in overseas countries in the Middle East, and that these investments were in jeopardy due to public opinion in those countries, and that it would be helpful if the United States followed a more neutral policy. Well, the result of that was that the media went into a feeding frenzy about the anti-Semitism of the Mobil Oil Company. They were summoned before a so-called congressional committee headed by Scoop Jackson, the most Zionized member of the U.S. Senate, and were browbeaten and threatened and all this sort of thing. You know, I think these people I think that they really could hardly survive if they didn't go with the program. There's just too much government and political pressure on them. Elon Musk, who himself is Jewish, seems to be under attack now. I don't know if you all have noticed that, but you know, he's appeared on the Babylon Bee and stuff, and they're beginning to make negative statements about him in the media and about his Tesla car and this kind of thing. So I think that that's one factor. They just have to conform. And the other factor is that these are people without any race. They are without any religion. They're without any moorings in life at all. They're individuals. Many of them are libertarians. They've been growing up in an Ayn Rand ideological environment. And they don't feel that there's anything to which they owe any loyalty. They're strictly individuals. They're looking out for number one.
Well, Sam, in terms of let's say a corporation's approach to things, well, why not say nothing about about inclusion, diversity, and whatever the rest of it is? Say
Paul,
nothing. You don't have to say you don't.
Paul, you are a learned person with many decades in the trenches. Being silent when everybody else is chanting "Long live Comrade Stalin" does not exempt you. The fact that you're not yelling "Death to Comrade Stalin" that doesn't help you. All the very fact that you're silent means that you're going to have trouble if you're not chanting "Long live Comrade Stalin." And when one of them does it, all the others have to do it. Yeah, they all have to fall in line.
Do you really think it is that bad?
I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is that I was saying about the people that the WASPs, the related demographics who are captains of industry. These are pod people. They have no identity. Charles and I like to jab at each other about English history, and I like to jab at him at being a follower of the heresiarch Archbishop Laud. These people would never know what you were talking about. They know so little about their history and their background. They wouldn't know Archbishop Laud from pork lard. They're not real people. They're not real people. They're pod people. But throughout the whole Chamber of Commerce business element, there's another people. And these people are very much in contact with who they are. And they liaise, and they know exactly who they are, and they have an agenda, and they intend to pursue that agenda. And that agenda is turns on the criterion, is it good for our community? And these people are able to organize society where everything is the same. It's like Hitler, they said, had a policy of, I think, was it like something or other. I can't think of it now, but the idea was that all German society would run on parallel train tracks. The lawyers, the doctors, the academics, the peasants, the farmers, the industry, everybody would be with the ideological program. And we have that Gleichschaltung. That's what we have in America. And this element that is sprinkled throughout all these companies has the ability to get all the ants organized and moving in the same direction from the hive. And especially when they're dealing with pod people, do you think Bill Gates has ever in his life been interested in Archbishop Laud or Hengist or Hereward? I mean, these are people without a country. They're without a soul. They're not even human beings.
I guess they're the sort of person described by T.S. Eliot as the hollow man.
Yes.
Heads full of straw. I mean, they may or may not be relatively shrewd at making money and so on, but they have no substance. That the few bigwigs I have talked to in corporations on similar issues, I got that impression that there's no substance to them. At one point, I was going to a number of annual meetings and raising the question of temporary foreign workers. It was an issue up here in Canada, and was trying to get a commitment from our company, as the case might be, that we would use Canadian labor and Canadian labor only. And I was told no uncertain terms. Well, the discussion it would be pretty obvious, but but it was clear to me that they felt beyond the slogan. Oh yes, of course we'll hire Canadians first. There was no substance there. They didn't get it. They didn't think that there had to be really any loyalty to us if they could bring in people from the Sudan to work in meat packing plants, and they could work them for the minimum wage, and Canadian workers would want a little bit more for such dirty work. That was okay. That suited them just fine.
No, I think that's how they function. There was an interesting thing years ago when Mitt Romney was running for president. By the way, you will have heard that Mitt Romney has declared now that Tucker Carlson is a traitor for daring to have the slightest deviation from the party line. He's now a traitor. The great patriot Mitt Romney has identified the traitor. But anyway, Mitt Romney, as you probably know, having cast your nets in this sea for a long time, labored in this vineyard for a long time, Mitt Romney made his money by systematic betrayal of his people. He made his money by directing and the deindustrialization of America, acquiring American businesses and moving our industrial capacity to foreign countries. And this guy had the gall then to think he deserved to be president of the country he betrayed. There was a point in his campaign where he was confronted by some workers who had lost their jobs in one of the factories that he had moved overseas, and they confronted him about this. And I watched with great interest. He seemed to be genuinely nonplussed, just absolutely without a clue. How dare these people ask this question? This is how you make money. The idea that he, as a captain of industry and part of the elite, owed any kind of duty to little guys of his race and community, this just did not compute. And that's the difference. The Buckley conservatives, one of the many things they did that misled people was they confounded aristocracy with plutocracy. They believed that being rich and powerful meant you were an aristocrat. And most Americans believe this. There is no connection between an aristocrat out of our history and a plutocrat. One of the hallmarks of an aristocrat is that an aristocrat connects with his people. He leads his tenants into battle. He connects with his literature, with his language, and his peasants, his serfs, whatever you call them. He connects with them. But a plutocrat doesn't do that. A plutocrat is just a man of money. He's a cosmopolitan. And Romney just was the perfect illustration. For the first time in his life, he was having to pay a price, albeit a small one, not the price that peoples have generally imposed upon traitors, but his path to the White House was being impaired by these working class people who dared to think that he owed them a duty. And I think that's how these people feel. They're just pod people.
I find that doubly disturbing because Romney, at least theoretically, knows who he is. He has a faith. Supposedly, he's a Mormon, but I guess that doesn't have any influence one step outside the tabernacle.
Oh, they're not. I'm sure you have Mormons like you have Presbyterians and Roman Catholics who are. There's so many amazing episodes in history and in public events that go unmarked. When Kennedy was running for president in 1960, the issue still arose among some Protestants about what was called the Bloody Oath under Elizabeth I, was they made the Roman Catholics take an oath in England that they owed allegiance to the crown and not to the Pope. And this had lingered on in some Protestant thinking. There was some concern about the Catholic teachings of the power and the authority of the Pope. And Kennedy made a statement to the Southern Baptist Convention in which he said no one needed to worry about this because his religion would never have any impact whatsoever on what he did in office. My father, who is the descendant of French Huguenot martyrs, it was a Presbyterian, he read this aloud in the living room. He said, it would be better morally if he said that he was an absolute disciple of the Pope, who if the Pope told him to jump, would ask how high on the way up, than have a man tell you that his religion will never impact any decision he ever makes. That's just an amazing statement. But I think it was one of the few times in Kennedy's life where he probably told the truth. He lapsed into truth.
I mean, it really is an extraordinary statement about what one's commitment to one's faith. I mean, basically none.
Well, I'm speechless. I mean, I was not familiar with that quote. I mean, I did grow up with people who said very loudly that they were very suspicious of a Catholic becoming president. because they believed that the country would be basically run from Rome. And my mother, blessed memory, I don't know, I've never seen his books anywhere else, but she had a series of books that she was very interested in by somebody named Paul Brown in the 1950s, who basically predicted that the Catholic Church would ally itself ultimately with communism, and the Catholic Church was basically an agent of communism.
Oh, for Pete's sake. And that's a bit much. That's not fair to the papists. Not that we mustn't be unfair to them.
I've heard Roman Catholics say that the Jesuits.
Well, I think that's true. I know there are people like that. Graham Greene, the famous Roman Catholic novelist, he explicitly said that. He went and had friendly relations with Kim Philby after Philby defected to Moscow. And he said that he felt that the Kremlin and the Vatican should get together, that they had a common problem. But these are just people playing with ideas. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church was so persecuted by the communists, and their views are so divergent from the Marxist view of the world that could never be.
How about the present Pope, though, as a fulfillment of that prophecy?
Well, I think like all the churches, they've gone, they go with the flow. In the Middle Ages, the church was telling the peasants that they shouldn't complain when the aristocrats trampled all the turnips on their fox hunt and left the peasants to starve to death. Now, that was when the aristocrats and the kings ran everything. Now that when the communists were coming in, of course they were going to be sucking up to the communists. And the Jesuits above all. If you look at the Jesuits' whole history, Ignatius Loyola's idea was that the Jesuits would become tutors to the children of prominent people and attach themselves to royal families, and they would insinuate themselves into positions of power in order to stop the Reformation and help the Counter-Reformation. Well, this pro-communist slant that the Society of Jesus has taken in our times is just a continuation of that strategy.
Sean, I didn't quite understand your question. You texted us food shortage and liberty. What's that all about?
Well, the new reset is supposed to be globalization of pretty much everything, right? If I understand that at the base of it, right? Everything is about the group, and the group is the whole planet. But Biden just said he expects that we're going to experience a food shortage, and that's going to result from the imposition of the tariffs on Russia. And as you guys were talking about the problems that we have, the thing that keeps coming back to me is valuing the group welfare over individual liberty, individual rights, versus letting each individual value his or her own individual rights over the welfare of any group. And I'm just wondering, in the next 12 months, if we actually do have a food shortage, like Biden said, and we have to shift to a statist-run distribution of food, how much liberty are we going to be willing to give up in order to get our ration? It seems like the result of this war that's going on right now could go both ways. In one way, it could get us to the situation that Paul discussed in the beginning, the ultimate goal of the globalists. It could get us there a lot quicker, because we have no choice but to give up our liberties in order to get our daily ration. But the other side of that is people could become so frustrated with the way the war is going, and just, we could be blessed with the collapse of the government we now have. So which way do you think a food shortage will take us? And do you think we'll really have a food shortage?
Well, Paul, I mean, you've been very interested in the trucker situation. Isn't that sort of a direct transition between one crisis and the next? I mean,
it was. I'm not saying that the Ukraine situation developed to get Justin Trudeau out of hot water over the truckers. That absurd, but it's certainly being used that way. Um, the truckers were, and I should say are, this whole end the lockdown and the mandates uh, movement has been a tremendous challenge to the globalists and to the control freaks. They all united around, the ever changing prescriptions, but always they're mandatory. Forced masks, and then forced vax, and then you can't fly if you haven't been vaxxed, or you can't hold this job if you haven't been vaxxed.
Paul, we do believe in COVID. We do believe in COVID.
I know. I'm only describing what but there was a huge pushback, and this has absolutely shaken the Canadian elite. In fact, Mark Carney, who I mentioned before, said because during the truckers' protests in Ottawa, that they should be charged with sedition, sedition for having nonviolent protests. And what was reported in most of the Canadian media was so negative. Even I didn't know until just this afternoon. I was part of a convoy, and we rallied in a small town about 40 miles from Hamilton. That the truckers' protest started each morning with this huge crane, and I saw that today, that would lift the Canadian flag up to the top. And when it got there, they sang the national anthem and they said a prayer. I never heard about the prayer before, and it was such a benign, gentle event, and yet it was portrayed as somehow the black shirts back in town. But the rebellion against this is ongoing. Yeah, there be protests right across Canada this weekend. I was part of that one today out of Hamilton, Ontario. But there are mirror protests. This is not going away, and a lot of people are getting educated. That's what I find so exciting. People will come up to you, and I mean, they know about Klaus Schwab. They know about the World Economic Forum. They know about the Great Reset. For years, Sam and I have labored in the vineyards and often found people who basically are clueless. They're not that they're not educated, but they're clueless. A lot of these people have learned, and they've learned fast. And they've also learned another important thing, that the media lies. In other words, you can't trust the mass media. Oh, yes, and you can't trust the banks either, because they were too willing to go along with Trudeau's scheme, Trudeau's order to seize the bank accounts, freeze the bank accounts of, well, it was never clear who, leaders of the trucker movement, but also some poor single mom who gave $50 to GoFundMe to the truckers, single mom on minimum wage. She had a bank account frozen. Well, that has been a big learning experience, as we used to say in the education racket. And it's amazing to see people understand. People now have heard about Klaus Schwab boasting back around 2002 or 3 that he's got a cadre of young globalists, really great young leaders coming along, like Justin Trudeau, Emmanuel Macron, and various others. And he said back in 2017 that over half of Justin Trudeau's cabinet were committed globalists. Now people are getting that now. And that information is way out there. Well, we have an increasingly educated group of people, and I find that very encouraging.
But how does the war and the tariffs against Russia lead to a food shortage in the developed world when you have pretty much the entire world, except for China and North Korea, imposing these tariffs? It would imply to me that means we're still all trading with each other. I mean, for how many centuries did we not have food shortages when, you couldn't pick your corn and sell it to Russia, so to speak. I mean, I don't see the mechanics of how we end up with a food shortage just because there's tariffs against Russia, because the rest of us should still be trading with each other. Why would we have a food shortage?
I think that's a very good question. There may be a food shortage in some parts of the Middle East and the third world that have depended quite heavily on Ukrainian and Russian wheat now, wheat and other grains. But how this would result in a food shortage in Poughkeepsie in New York or Winnipeg, Canada, I don't know. We're a major food producer. Our trade lines to California and Mexico, other that provide a lot of our fruits and vegetables, they're intact. I don't get the food shortages for us. Yes, there might be some shortages in some parts of the third world.
Well, I'd put out the question for a moment. Why did oil prices go up instantly when this war started? There hadn't been enough time for there to be any interruption, even in a pipeline to Western Europe, and the prices. Oil in California and all over the United States started shooting up. I think that the point is that we live in a globally monitored and managed marketplace. And so people artificially set prices and production and probably storage of food and non-moving of products in general in order to manipulate prices. Would any of you disagree with that?
I know what the libertarians would say, Charles. The libertarians are saying it makes sense to me that if the oil companies anticipate that oil is going to cost more and they're selling off their current inventory, they need to sell the current inventory at a price where they can replace it with newly acquired inventory. But I think there's something else, and this sounds very conspiratorial, and I'm not generally into that kind of thing, but there are all kinds of excuses they give for the increased prices. They're not enough longshoremen, they're not unloading the boats fast enough from China. We've heard all these excuses. Well, nothing is said, truthful, about the fact that the deficits are so staggering and how much money has been pumped into the economy by the Congress and the presidency in the last 2 years. The New York Times had an article that said that the money appropriated for COVID relief came out to $10,700 for every person in America. So for a family of four, you're talking about injecting $42,800 more money into the system. And common sense tells you that when the money supply expands to that size, the money buys less. I mean, that's just, you can't deny that. But they have come up with an economic theory that this isn't true. There's some woman that the New York Times was lionizing a few weeks back who has figured out that deficits and increases in the money supply have no impact on inflation. So that's just, of course, absurd. But anyway, the point is that I think the reason these prices are rising is probably in a great measure due to the giveaway programs and the fact that the Congress and the president will just keep going more and more heavily in debt and expanding the money supply. And blaming it on Putin is politically very advantageous to these people. Oh, this is a price we pay for democracy.
You're talking about inflation in general, but the jump in gas prices due to the war was, way out of proportion, even with increased inflation under Biden.
Well, a very small diminution in supply caused much greater increases in price. If for some reason 10% of all the housing units in America disappeared tomorrow morning, the cost of housing would not increase by 10%; it would increase by 30 or 40%. So when the supply gets cut off, oil had been artificially low for a long time, with the fracking and all this sort of stuff. So I don't know, but the main thing is that that we have tremendous inflation. It can't possibly be at the rate the government says. The government says it's at 5.9%. Do you know of anything that's gone up less than it hasn't gone up vastly more than 5.9%? Rent and housing are up 14%. That's a third of the normal family's budget. A 14% cost there. Food is up, gas is up, energy is up, everything is up. But they what on earth has only gone up 5.9%? The Tibetan prayer wheels? Everything you need has gone up way over 5.9%. And this is useful to the government because old people like me that get Social Security, our Social Security is supposed to go up with inflation. Well, if the real inflation rate is 14%, as I think it probably is, and they put our Social Security up 5.9%, the government has saved a lot of money. And so this is very attractive to them. They've watered down the cost of Social Security. And anyway, I think that plays a big role in this.
I think a lot of what's going on is the fulfillment of the globalist agenda, the agenda of interdependence. And again, I'll just kind of keep harking back to when I was in grad school, which was in 1998 is when I started. And redistributing global wealth was among the top issues, the top agenda issues for the globalist and the political science community and the economic community, the academic community.
What was the name of the woman you mentioned, Sean? I wanted you to get that. I didn't get that earlier.
I didn't hear what you said.
I said, what was the name of the woman that you mentioned earlier? You said that she was a big influence on all this.
Albright, Madeleine Albright.
Oh, Madeleine Albright.
She graduated from Columbia. So when I was in grad school, she was like, they just thought she was the greatest thing in the world, because I went to grad school at Columbia, right? So I was in a master's program for international affairs, but that's very political science-ish. And they just thought she was the best thing in the world. But her whole global, I just can't believe she was even allowed to become the Secretary of State. But she was, and that whole camp of thought believes in global interdependence. They wanted to create economic blocks, and then they wanted to make the economic blocks dependent on each other so we wouldn't have any major world wars, because the NAFTA bloc would have to trade with the European bloc, and I guess everybody would have to trade with Russia and China, and would be so dependent on each other, war wouldn't happen. And of course, here we are, and not only is war happening, we're about to stumble into World War III. I would say that we're already in World War III. We're at Manchuria in 1939. And anyway, that scholarly bloc wanted very much so to redistribute wealth. And because taxation was so unpopular in the United States, the way to do it is monetary policy. So by expanding money supply and redistributing wealth that way, you undermine the value of the currency that people are sitting on, because people are no longer sitting on silver coins and bars of gold. They're sitting on 401ks, IRAs, and other types of pension plans. And Americans traditionally had a lot of that, particularly the baby boomers, and the baby boomers were never going to give that up. So if you could bypass any strife in the streets, because you don't have to go into their strong box and take the bar of gold, take their coins. You just let them have their 401ks, you let them have their IRAs, you let them have the growth that they see in the stock market, and you just use money supply. So you expand money supply, it causes all of their funds to go up. So then the American boomers will be happy. But then you give more of that money supply to the people you want to redistribute the wealth to, and it gradually moves it in the other direction, which is why you see the open borders, the immigrants who are almost predominantly non-white. You see a lot of complaints now from the left, they don't want the Ukrainians coming here because Ukrainians are white, you know, and but nobody's calling them racist, right? You know, so anyway, I guess I'm just kind of babbling on here a bit, but what's happening right now all seems to have been part of the agenda that I remember being preached and shoved down our throats, shoved into our minds when I went to graduate school, and it's all happening now. The only thing that's not supposed to be there is the shooting war in Ukraine. That's the thing that's not supposed to be there. But
yeah, I find that shocking that this was mainstream common ideology being taught a decade or more ago. Basically, it was the Great Reset, the Great Distribution, and I heard the name of the university you attended, and I don't think it was in North Korea. I mean that's just called classical hopped up neo-Marxism, and this is what Ivy League people are being taught. No wonder they're so much of our senior echelons are people by folks who hate our way of life and have another agenda, or at least are open to that agenda. And I suppose there weren't too many people saying, "Now that wouldn't be right," or "That's wrong for these are those reasons."
Well, I was going to try and just put a couple of anecdotes that don't really speak to any trend or provide evidence of any trend or theory, but one anecdote is I would speak up and express my thoughts, and I was always labeled as like it was like going back to high school or even before that, where I was like the kid that nobody wanted to sit with at the lunchroom. You know, that's what graduate school was like for me. And I was this because I'm from the heartland. I'm therefore just a dumb, sheltered American from the backwoods, and I was an enlisted man, not an officer, and they just treated it, well, it must be some kind of affirmative action. They just needed one, you know. They needed a sergeant in the class so they could round it out instead of having, I was a staff sergeant when I got out, instead of having all of the officers. And it was kind of like that. And I don't really resent the officers. I had great officers, I had terrible officers, but most of them, I have to say, were great. And I always admired, I admire the British House Cavalry. I admire their tradition. I admire their pride. And there was this British officer sitting in front of me, across from me one time, when we were having this sort of intellectual exercise of what if there was a war, and the people who are specializing in security, those students, that was like their project. So they asked all the veterans, would you please participate, because the civilians don't know what it's like to have a command exercise, and they wanted to put a veteran in each group. So I participated, and at lunch break, I was sitting across from this royal officer, and he was the epitome of what a British officer should be: prim, proper, well-spoken, and it was just getting on my nerves so much, and I couldn't help but do it. And I hate eating with my hands. I generally don't do that, but he was there. I just wanted to see what this upper crust British officer would do if I ate a piece of fried chicken with my hands instead of cutlery. And I did, just to get on his nerves, and it did get on his nerves. But there was another, I remember this Mexican girl and she would keep harping on consumption. And she was one of the more outspoken people in the class, but everybody always seemed to agree with her. The biggest problem with the international affairs was American consumption. I remember her beating the table one day in the class: consumption. And this was back in 1998, 2000. And redistribution of wealth was like the number one thing on her mind, not redistributing it from America's wealthy to America's poor, but from the United States to the rest of the world. And she wasn't alone in that. That really was the drive, the force. That it's not an accident that I think the borders are open. I think the globalists have wanted open borders for a long time, because we're not willing to redistribute our wealth through a global welfare program. And there have been a lot of people who wanted to set that back up all the way back then, who felt that there should be welfare from Europe, from the United States, from Canada to South America and to Africa, like where they would go to their own office, they'd sign up for a welfare check and they would get it, and it would come out of our tax money. That kind of thing was being tossed around back then. But I mean, I've kind of rambled on here a bit, but anyway, I just thought I'd share that.
Well, I don't think you need to worry about them redistributing the wealth. I think they talk about that, but I don't. I think the people in charge do not intend to redistribute the wealth. I think they intend to grind down the middle classes and to weaken people economically. The standard of living for most Americans has gone down since the 1970s. They're not aware of that, but it's happened. Well, one thing that strikes me is about American society in general is how nobody in public life is accountable. You know,
Right.
the right questions are never asked, and they are never held accountable. There was an interesting moment when the COVID thing really hit, and Fauci changed his mind and said that we needed to have masks. And it came out we couldn't get the masks and we couldn't get the ventilators because none of them were made in America. They're all made in China. And the Chinese were using them for themselves and weren't going to sell us any until they had all they needed. Well, for 40 or 50 years of my life, I had heard people like Biden deride people like Pat Buchanan as economic dinosaurs when they made a statement that is obviously true, which is you can't have a sovereign nation that doesn't make its own stuff. And they told us, there'd never be any blowback from shipping the factories overseas like Mitt Romney did. This would just never, that only an ignorant fool would think that there'd be a price to pay. Well, here, Biden was exposed. His policies have been followed, and there were no masks, and there were no ventilators. We couldn't get the masks, we couldn't get the ventilators. And nobody pointed this out, that this is the result of policies that Joe Biden had supported as U.S. Senator throughout his whole career. And no one ever asked the obvious question. So you can't have a sovereign nation without making your own stuff. And Russia may emerge from this better off if I hope the sanctions are held in place long enough for Russia to become an autarky, a completely independent economic unit, and then America won't have any leverage to apply to Russia. They'll make everything themselves.
Well, I'm a great fan of that wonderful rebellion, that 15-year rebellion in Rhodesia, where we more or less ran the place, and as a population of about 6 million blacks, 300,000 whites at the maximum, and it was the victim of almost universal world sanctions. And that population of 300,000 ended up manufacturing an amazing number of things, from weapons and so on, and household goods. They couldn't manufacture airplanes, of course, but it was amazing what a population, about 2/3 the size of the city I live in right now, was able to do. And I've thought about that in terms of Russia. Yes. I don't like to see the people suffer through these sanctions. I don't like to see the Ukrainians suffering through war, but there may be some good that comes of that. Canada had exactly the same experience with what they call PPE. When they started deciding, we need masks and various other things. Where can we get some? We don't make them anymore. Okay. Who's the supplier? The United States? No, China. Okay. The trust fund kid placed an order with China. The stuff we got was garbage. They sent us their defective crap, and so there then had to be a real blitz campaign to start to retool manufacturing for some of these items, and I think the United States did the same. But yes, we learned, in a bitter lesson, that the Chinese, to which our elites, both nominally conservative or liberal, have sucked up to since 1970, that country is intensely unreliable. And the idea is, even if they manufacture it there, they'll still have to sell it to us. No, they don't have to. And one of the things that really worries me is that China is getting fairly close to a near monopoly on some of the rare earth minerals that are crucial to some of the so-called, the supposed technology of the future. The electric batteries and so on that are going to power our cars when we no longer use carbon. And I know that's another topic altogether, but China plays dirty, and China plays for keeps, and our elites operate in a delusional universe.
Well, you can't blame the Chinese. They're doing what they should do. We are not doing. We Anglo-Saxons and related German Americans and Irish Americans and the others, we are not doing what we need to do. We should be doing what China's doing. And there's an Italian proverb. I used to know it in Italian, but like with so many things at my age, it slipped away. That if you make yourself into a sheep, the wolves will find you. And Americans have made themselves into sheep, and the wolves are coming. It's the way life works. It's the nature of the universe.
Yeah, Kipling talked about the laws of nature, and this is certainly one of them. When we were far ahead of China technologically and so on, up to maybe a decade ago, we could perhaps afford these ridiculous policies, but we're not. They are a credible and dangerous competitor, and they see themselves in the ascendancy, and they're on the rise. And I think too many in the West have become are prepared to accept that we are on the decline, and we will continue to decline, and that's just the way it is. Well, that's not a mindset for effective competition, in my opinion.
You remember who started the buildup of China? Well, China was going to build up anyway. I mean, it's in the cars. No one can stop China. In many ways, the situation is analogous to, say, 1900 between Britain and Germany. There was much anger in Britain at the fact that Germany was taking Britain's markets. But it was inevitable. The Germans had reunited and had finally been able to unite themselves, and they were building up. Britain had been the industrialized center of the world, from the Napoleonic Wars on, but that couldn't go on forever. So inevitably, China was going to industrialize. But it was Henry Kissinger and Nixon who flew to China, and started the buildup of China. And Kissinger's idea was, well, we're going to build up China against Russia. And this is just classic stuff. It's the way we built up the Soviet Union against Germany, things like that. And now there's a cuck here in Georgia who will go nameless because he's a friend of mine, but he was explaining how the present economic world situation could be used by a clever president, as opposed to Biden, to solve the two great objectives of American foreign policy. And those objectives were, number one, to get rid of Putin and Russia, and to secure Taiwanese independence. So he explained that what we could do now that Russia is bogged down in Ukraine is to arm the Chinese and support them and enable the Chinese to take over Russia and colonize it and get access to all of its resources. But in exchange, China would recognize Taiwanese independence, and this would be a great win-win for America. Only Americans are that bereft of any understanding of geopolitical strategies to think that anything good would come from us, from having the Asiatic race take over 1/6 of the globe that presently belongs to our people, and take themselves all the way to the borders of Romania and Poland and the Balkan states and Finland. But these people have no racial origin or orientation at all. They're just out of the loop. Paul, you've disappeared.
I hope that idea does not catch on, but it sounds just stupid enough that,
Well, Henry Kissinger would like it. That great astute Henry Kissinger, like the other great astute Madeleine Albright. Traditionally, no nation allowed the position of foreign minister to fall in the hands of somebody who wasn't native born. We've had two alien foreign born secretaries of state in a period of about 50 years. And then you look at Albright, they were extolling her on all things considered on National Public Radio this week. remember her casual, contemptuous remark about the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children that starved to death as a result of our sanctions, that they were just collateral damage? And yet now she and her type are all full of moral self-righteousness toward Putin. Blinken's even talking about how Putin has to be put on trial for crimes against humanity because there have been 1,000 civilians killed by the Russians in the Ukraine war. Americans, I'm sorry to say, are not mirror people. They don't seem to look in the mirror and see themselves.
I find that very disturbing, as we said the other night, considering the horrific war crimes that were committed by the United States and Britain in the battle with, the so-called good war against Germany, the massacre of civilians in fire bombings of civilian targets like Dresden, or in Japan, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These were war crimes. You might set a little bit better if, before denouncing Putin as a war criminal, the people making those denunciations, like Blinken and others, would at least acknowledge, well, we've done very bad things in the past, and we're not entirely. No, but they don't. As you say, Sam, it's as if there are no mirrors.
No, no one ever holds them accountable. Nobody in American journalism will ever make this obvious point. It's like nobody in American journalism made the obvious point about Trump's call to Ukraine to try to get them to recommence a criminal investigation of the company that was pouring money into Hunter Biden. The media and the politicians went into a morality fit that, he was trying to cause them to bring this investigation because the Bidens were involved. This was so terrible. Nobody saw that for the finger pointing at Trump, there were three fingers pointing back at Biden, because he had admittedly threatened to cut off foreign aid when he was vice president if the Ukrainians didn't stop the corruption investigation. But nobody ever made that obvious point. Nobody in the media. Our media is just fantastic. All of these newspapers and radio stations and television, the tens of thousands of journalists, right, and every single one of them, with maybe the exception of Tucker Carlson, is an absolute lockstep. It's the most fantastic.
You started that off a few minutes ago, Sam, with the observation that they're never held accountable, and that's what. That's what particularly bothers me. I will avoid the COVID aspect of the discussion, but on these other things, and I guess it was always a Hollywood creation of the hard-nosed, no-nonsense journalist with his fedora on at a rakish angle and a cigarette dangling out of his mouth, and ready to confront power with snarky questions. Well, if that ever existed, you couldn't find it today, with the odd exception.
No, they're all in lockstep. It's just amazing. Here in Atlanta a week ago, 3 blacks were convicted in federal court, surprisingly enough, of arson. They had burned down buildings, and they had left behind bricks with notes attached to the bricks saying that this was done by the Proud Boys, in an effort to create a false attack. These blacks were smart enough to know how the media would work, and they had done this. But anyway, this came out. They were convicted. It was exposed that they had left these things trying to frame the Proud Boys. It was in Atlanta. Not one single news outlet in the state of Georgia covered that. It's completely airbrushed out. It's just beyond living under Goebbels or Stalin. The media is just fantastic.
Yeah, and in the land of the free, similar story, perhaps not quite as dramatic, but in part of the deep state propaganda against the truckers, there are many worries thrown around about violence, insurrection, weapons. Up in this pussy country, weapons in a vehicle. Oh my God! Anyway, there was a repeated rumor that there had been a loaded, I think, shotgun seized from one of the truckers in the protests in Ottawa. There's a parliamentary committee looking into into the Emergency Measures Act and what happened. And a conservative member of Parliament, to his credit, asked the Ottawa, the guy, this guy's a real thug, the Ottawa acting chief of police, what was any loaded shotgun found among the truckers? The top cop cogitated for a moment or two and then said, well, that there would be no charges laid. Well, the MP came right back and said, no, I didn't ask it, were there any charges? Was there any loaded weapon found? Yes or no? And he again obfuscated, third time. Was there any loaded weapon found? Well, in the end, he had to say no. But that's the that would be extraordinary, and I don't think that I saw that reported in one media outlet. But that's an incredibly important bit of information to help balance all the rumors that were put out about violence and insurrection, and there was no insurrection. It was an utterly peaceful event, but the media was quite happy to go along with spreading those lies. Of course, serve the interests of of Trudeau and the globalists.
We have too many laws.
Yeah, so go ahead.
We have too many laws. Entirely too many criminal laws. It just seems like, I mean, would as much of our population be in prison if this was like 1830?
Yes. I was told by a federal magistrate judge when I was a young lawyer who's a friend of my parents. They said that every American citizen, at least everyone over the age of 18, is an unindicted felon. He said there's so many laws, there's so many regulatory laws that every single American commits felonies all the time. And when they want to, they can cook these things up, and they have cooked them up. They took down an immigration restrictionist advocate in Maryland he's one of these black powder people that makes your own gunpowder or something. I'm not into guns, so I don't quite know what that is. But they raided his house. He had been leading demonstrations in front of the local congressperson's office, who was very pro-open borders. And the ATF raided his house. And he was then indicted because certain ingredients are supposed to be kept a certain distance apart. And they found two of these, they said, were too close together in the storage bin. And so they got him. Yeah, there are just entirely too many laws. They also have created multiple laws for one offense. In Georgia, they have things like, if you assault somebody, that's a crime. If you assault somebody that's over 65, that's a crime. If you assault somebody who's a cripple, that's a crime. If you assault, so they're able to conjure out of the same incident 10 or so indictments. You're indicted for assaulting the person. You're indicted for hate crime because the person was a member of some identifiable regime support group. You indict them because the person at the other side was above a certain age. You indict them for conspiracy to do this. So the same incident leads to 10 counts in the indictment. And the idea is that they'll get the jury to compromise. If they go in and 6 jurors say he's innocent and 6 say he's guilty, they'll compromise and only convict him of 5. And of course, that has the same effect of convicting on all. So that's a common prosecutorial trick. But that's the kind of country we live in.
Sam, do you remember a movement among, I think, some conservatives maybe 20 years ago, and I always thought there was some value to that if we get elected, we will reduce the number of laws and regulations by 10% each year, which at least would force legislatures to go over the corpus of laws and regulations and say, well, how many of these are even relevant, or how many of these really serve any useful purpose. So if you have that discipline of having to reduce it by 10%, we might begin to move toward a less regulated situation. I don't know if that was actually ever done, but I always thought that was a pretty good idea, and perhaps doable too.
It's not. It would not be feasible because these laws are all there because somebody powerful wants them there, and they're not going to let them be repealed. And the politicians like to pass more laws all the time. It's what Sam Francis called a narco-tyranny. Because there's all this disorder in society, the middle classes demand order and law. And the politicians therefore increase the number of regulations and laws, and this leads to tyranny. And so the anarchy and the tyranny each abet each other. There's a wonderful example here in Georgia. We have one of the most remarkably horrible set of Republican leaders in the country. They're just beyond description, the top 4 Republicans. And they have now hatched this one. You'll be happy to know that our elected representatives are at work for our behalf. They're going to amend the law or pass a law to create a special unit of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, which of course means hiring more of these cops and giving them jobs and taxing people. And this group will be, its purpose will be to investigate cold cases of lynchings. Really?
My God. I mean,
the last thing that is called a lynching in Georgia took place in the 1940s. If there were an 18-year-old involved in that incident, he would be almost 100 years old. The law expressly says that they're to focus on what they claim happened to Black members of the state legislature who were expelled in 1868. You would have police officers investigating, and of course, don't forget, Leo Frank in 1913. That's one that they're going to have to unveil, dust that off too. But what a joke. You know, what a waste of the taxpayers' time and money. But it's a gimmick. It's a way for Governor Kemp and Attorney General Chris Carr and Ralston, the state house speaker, and you have Lieutenant Governor Duncan. It's a way for them to pursue their lunacy, their mirage that they're going to get a third of the Black vote. They're going to go around and tell the Blacks that, oh, while I was your governor, we passed the law to investigate the 1868 expulsion of Black, the GBI, that have police officers working this important issue. Forget the murders, forget the rapes, forget the riots, forget the arsons. We're on the job. We know where the crime problem is.
So, the original topic was the Great Reset, and it occurs to me that there's a movie that really embodies the most valuable reset. I mean, what you're talking about is so stupid. It's just unspeakable.
Only in a democracy can you have something this ridiculous.
But do you remember the Great Reset at the end of Dr. Strangelove? Nobody remembered. Sean, do you know the movie Dr. Strangelove?
Isn't the reset he rides an atomic weapon out of the plane? Is that what we're talking about?
Exactly. The Great Reset at the end of Dr. Strangelove, when Dr. Strangelove gets up and says, "Mein Führer, it is a miracle I can walk." And at that moment, the doomsday machines all over Russia go off, and the world comes to an end in atomic warfare. That is the Great Reset we have to look forward to.
I hope not. It's just, I don't know. I despair of people. It's just so ridiculous. Here's something I'm waiting to say, and then I'm going to have to leave because I do need to go to bed. But Paul, where does Paul's picture has disappeared from the screen.
Paul keeps cloning himself and then reappearing.
There's the Paul. You talked about climate change, and I'm not convinced there isn't climate change. I think it's very likely there is climate change. I don't see how you can be pumping all of these gases into the atmosphere and not have a change. But the thing that strikes me is, do you recall in the early 70s when there was talk of climate change? Anybody remember back then?
Oh, I totally remember. We were going to have a new ice age. And I specifically remember the very first time I went to Boston. I think I was 6 or 7 years old. And they said that a new ice age is coming and it will wipe out Boston.
Well, I don't remember the ice age. I remember they were talking about the temperature going up, but the ones I knew. But there was a friend of mine who was in Emory Medical School, who was my best friend in high school, and he hung out with a group of really brilliant boys who were and they were talking about climate change. And what you would see this, you see things like in the media about this. The concern was that the forest canopy of the world was being destroyed by third world people who are now armed with the white man's chainsaw. And every year they would have a picture and they would show the jungles receding in Africa and Brazil. And that all made sense to me. I mean, you have what they call the heat bubble. In the summer, the temperature in Atlanta is 5, 6, 7 degrees hotter than it is 50 miles out. And when you strip the canopy off the planet will be hotter. But nothing is said about that now. Only the carbons are mentioned. I'm open to the idea that the carbons could be a cause of this, but it's interesting that the business about the destruction of the forest has been completely airbrushed out. And I guess it's because it would require them to think about the non-whites in the third world, and therefore it can't be considered.
Well, that's interesting because I mean, I do know what you're talking about. You're talking about the concern about the greenhouse effect, and probably I doubt if even you were here when were you a part of David Duke's campaign for governor?
No.
Because when David Duke was running for governor in '91, his high water mark, basically, he made some wonderful Mardi Gras tokens. And I used to have a couple. I think I've lost them now, but I used to have a couple because one of them was advocating invading Brazil to save the rainforest. It was a really wonderful idea, and it was probably in some sense valid. Yes, they've threatened us with climate change many times, but yeah, the original climate change threat was that we were facing another ice age. And then
these guys were talking about heat that was going to cause the planet to heat up. And I think that's probably true. Anecdotally, it seems to me that the temperatures now are much milder than when I was a child. When I was a child, it got cold in Georgia around Thanksgiving, and it stayed cold until April. Now, it's like an extended fall, punctuated by an occasional freeze.
Pipes in New Orleans used to freeze every winter, and they don't anymore. No,
Yeah.
There's something going on, but what the cause of it is? I mean, I guess the greatest thing about both the pandemic and Ukraine is it's wiped Greta Thunberg off the map. She is now collecting unemployment somewhere.
Well, I wanted to close with my last point, and then I will leave. You have to admire the people of Britain. Tony Blair cannot go out in public in Britain. In fact, he's moved to Israel. The Israelis have built him a mansion, and he lives in Israel. Do you know that? That is what he has done. But anyway, when he appears in Britain, people scream at him, "Murderer, murderer," because of his involvement in the lies about the weapons of mass destruction, getting us involved in the war against Iraq. Here in America, Bush is absolutely the Bush II, no accountability at all. He's still going around making speeches. He's written a book now arguing for more immigration. He's a great guy. He criticizes Trump. This is a guy who quite clearly lied to the American people. And as a result, thousands of our own men were killed, many times that lost arms and legs. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis died in all this. And the guy pays no price for it at all. This is a remarkable time in history. The most remarkable thing about America today is the passivity of the people. There's never been a people in history as passive as Americans are in the face of things like this. In a normal society, Bush would have paid a tremendous price. His people would have called him in ancient Rome or Greece, to go into your area of expertise, Charles. What would have been the fate of an emperor or of Pericles in Athens if he had done something like this? Would he be writing a book arguing for more Persian immigrants coming into Athens? I don't think so.
The problem
Good
is
night,
that
y'all. I've enjoyed this. Good night. I've got to go. I'm tired and ill.
Feel better. Thank you. Thank you for tonight, and thank you last night too.
All right, thanks.
Bravo. Sean.
anybody who speaks up in the way that Sam just said, they investigate you, they watch you, and they get you on something. That's what they did with me. You know, if you start complaining about the government, you get a visit and you get phone calls, and then before you know it, you get arrested until you learn to shut up. That's why that doesn't happen. So it's not just at the I wouldn't say passive is maybe part of it, but I think part of it is people just know to keep their mouth shut. That's why. Even if everybody agreed with what he just said, they just keep their mouth shut out of fear.
Well, Paul, why don't you make a final wrap-up statement here? We've been going for a while, and golly, it's too depressing. I don't even know what to say. I guess my final comment was remembering the great reset of Dr. Strangelove. We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know when. What's your final words? Paul, are you there? Paul, wir kann nicht hören. Wir kannst nicht hören. You're silent. Where are you silent?
His mic's probably muted on the other. He's in there twice, so unmute one of the mics.
Paul, we can't hear a word you're saying. We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day. All right. On that note, we'll meet again some sunny day. Paul, you really can't resuscitate your sound. I think it's okay. Good night, everybody. Thank you very much, Sean and Paul. One more chance, Paul. We'll meet again. Don't know where, don't know when, but I know we'll meet again some sunny day. And we do believe in COVID. We do believe in COVID. We do believe in COVID and in the necessity and efficacy of all vaccines, boosters, and bears. Good night, everybody.